And we're live. Welcome, everybody. Yet another weekly performance roundtable for our group, Code Review. And we have a new attendee. So welcome, Shekar. Do you want to give a little intro on your role since you're here and we're being for everybody watching the recording? They might be questioning who you are, what are you doing, what's your interest here in this topic? Sorry to put you on the spot.
So I'm mostly here to listen today, but I'm a principal across the Create. I just joined recently. I was over in incubation and I was popped into here recently, and that's sort of my background here. I used to work at a bank before this. Doing as an architect in investment banking, working on IPOs and things like that. And prior to that, I spent some time at Microsoft and at Salesforce doing other like architecture stuff and engineering on Kubernetes and other platforms. So it's nice to meet everybody. I'm here and listening more, trying to understand what's going on, trying to make head or tail of what you guys are working on.
Awesome. Great to have you. Our discussions are kind of loose and they sometimes are initiated by just some brainstorming or an issue. So just take a look at the board that we have linked to the agenda. So the agenda is in the invite, so you should be able to get to that. It's public to the company. And yeah, feel free to create your own issues, your proposals, question everything. That's why it's a roundtable. Like everything's up to be questioned. So moving on to the topics that we have currently open. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to bring up again the microcode review front-end POC. Last week or last call, we had a couple of discussions spark out of that. I wanted to check the pulse here, and has there been any advances, anything we want to discuss a bit more about this POC, anything that anybody wants to share in particular? Right, and if not, I think we're still not, yeah, I don't feel comfortable yet closing that issue in particular. I mean, POC still has to be taken apart and pulled into particular feature proposals, I guess. But I guess the natural evolution, so I'll keep it open for now, and move over to the discussions that sparked from that particular proposal and POC, which is, we created an issue for a spike about rendering the MR diffs from diff blobs instead of line-by-line JSON structures. So there's been a couple of discussions in there already. So essentially, this is about like checking whether we're able to pull it off from having the backend deliver us a full blob rather than a line-by-line structure, which is causing some overhead for processing, but it could allow us to do some nifty things on the front end if we just take care of the whole diff at once. But then the question becomes, how do I identify the lines to match the notes and comments to the diff lines? Like that's the first biggest hurdle, which is, I can share the screen. Let me stop that. So share the screen. Kind of like one of our biggest questions is how can we match notes, comments, diff lines? I shared some brain dump here from the previous call to have UUIDs calculated both on the front end and back end that we can have it used to match those two ends. And then Thomas, you had something to share. Do you want to vocalize that since you're here?
Sure. Yeah. It seems like as long as, let me make sure I'm phrasing this correctly. If the backend is going to be delivering us fully baked diffs, which is a good idea, and an approach here, presumably they have some way of identifying each line of diff that they have. I don't know, there are a couple of mechanisms that we're using currently. I think right now our identifier is basically just like the file name hashed to SHA-1 and then like some line numbers appended to that or something like that. Or I think it might have it has like the 3 add, remove, change states also encoded into that, but it's basically just a SHA-1 of some plain text. But if there's some way to ID lines, they could just send those lines back with the HTML that they send along to us. I don't think that's a huge lift, because I think we already have ways of identifying line numbers or line codes. So it seems like that would be, if they could send those IDs back to us, looking those up in the returned structure that they send is pretty trivial for a browser, more or less. I said it's an O of 1. That's about right, I think. But I digressed a lot about
question
IDs.
immediately. The question immediately that jumps. Sorry for interrupting. Is so how were you? So if we're getting a blob out of the backend, syntax highlighted, I guess. How are we? So you're saying like add an attribute with an UID? Is that what you were thinking? Add a span with an ID or something?
Yeah, there's
like
the
that?
ID attribute, right?
Using an attribute,
the backend is sending us all of the the backend is sending us the lines. They're sending us the discussions. So it's not like we have to like generate anything if they send us all of the IDs. The discussions will link to this ID, and the lines will have that ID on them.
Though, like you said, below, this could be a pretty hefty increase in total payload size.
That would be the biggest thing, is just having all of the having everything in the DOM. I mean, it is, that data is somewhere always right now, right? Like just because it's not delivered to us in the DOM, it is delivered to us in data, and then we do the
the batch
match. We do the matching up. So that data is coming down somewhere, and the most efficient way to do it is probably HTML. That can be the compression there can happen probably a lot better than in like JSON. So.
Right.
The data is also written on the DOM, right? I mean, basically you get a document with the data attribute set containing the whole content anyway, right? So what's the difference?
So the difference is right now we get the difference is right now the request we do to render the diff lines is the batch diffs. And inside the batch diffs, we have the highlighted diff lines, and each one of the entry in that array is aligned, right? And within that object, we have pretty much all the metadata per line, which then we use the rich text to kind of like render the HTML of that. So as you can see, the line code is what we were talking about here. Would be the UID, I guess. We'll replace this with that. But the idea then that we're proposing is, instead of having this line by line, we would have something that similar to this. You have one thing with all the HTML for all the blob file diff kind of thing. This is per file, I guess. Yes, this would be per file. The main difference is this: like, we won't have a line by line. We'll have a one thing with all the HTML, but we lose all the metadata contextualized to that. I'm guessing the difference is that this would be markup instead of just like raw diff, right, Kerry?
Yeah.
And Thomas.
Yeah, that would, in my mind, that would be right. We would get markup back.
Okay. So it would be HTML here, which could carry the ID in there.
So, so the HTML is delivered because of syntax highlighting, essentially, right? Because you want to highlight the syntax. Okay, and so you dump the whole HTML there in the diff, and then that's per file. You render that out.
Correct. And last call, by the way, if you want to catch the recording, we discussed at length the possibility of doing syntax highlighting on the front end, like we're doing on the blog page, where we're using highlight.js, but the support, the language support, and the fidelity isn't as good as Rouge that we're using on the back end. So it feels like there's potentially some things we can do to pre-render or pre-calculate the diff syntax highlighted before it's needed to make it faster to deliver. But yes, at this moment, we're just discussing the delivery of that to the front end.
Got it.
Cool. Going back to this, where we were talking about this sort of thing. And spit this out. Yeah, so
one thought, before we move on, one thought about this, like the markup are not coming through on diff or dispatch. I don't think those are the same endpoints that are in the public API, but we should be sort of cognizant of the fact that like the public API is also used by people to render diffs, and so making sure we don't like make API endpoints that are like solely for us in our context. But I think
fair.
that's the case today. We just need to be aware.
Correct.
One
Yeah,
of
right now the
the,
batch diffs are only internally consumed.
Yeah, I would anticipate this is additive, not transformative.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons that we're talking about this even is because the demo is noticeably faster than our diffs on a lot of metrics. And so one of the questions is, how can we get something kind of like the public API, but for us? And one of the things that the public API does is just send the whole blob back. We don't get diff lines. It's just like, here's the diff, the blob of diff. And then I was doing the highlighting on the front end. But if we could replicate that somehow, that would be good.
I'm just trying to grab a demo so that we can catch another. Yeah, let's grab this URL. So that's what we're talking about. We can do something like 60. Hopefully that exists. Yes. And then switching over to that one just immediately because it's in cache in XDB. Yeah. So backend folks, what's your thoughts here about the proposal of having IDs attached to the markup of each line, and then being able to use the same IDs? And again, these IDs probably are new, I guess, because while we're at it, we want to make sure that we can match nodes to lines, but also account for files with the same name, account for merge request versions, and potentially even account for multi-line comments.
So Thomas, you need the IDs so you know which line we're attaching to.
I want to make sure I understood your question. You said we need unique IDs so that we know which line we're attaching, say, a comment to, for example. Yeah.
Yep.
I want to make sure I don't misspeak here. Yes.
That's good. If you do, we'll fix it in post. It'll be fine.
We'll edit it out. Yes, I think that's correct. I think that the primary reason for IDing a line is knowing where to put discussions. And that includes new discussions coming back. So like if the line doesn't have a discussion on it, the user has to be able to click and say, I would like on this line to create a discussion. Andre commented in the issue about, well, what if just kind of like the first line or like this blob of changes has an ID, and then we could do relative line numbers from there. Mm-hmm. Which I think would work. I think that's okay. It's just a matter of like, the problem is, do we always, the backend is going to have to be doing a lot of computation for that, because let's say someone changes one line in a diff. What we send back is, I believe it's like what, 3 lines before and 3 lines after or something like that. And so the blob that we get back is the ID'd line would actually not be the changed line. It would be an unchanged line. And then we say they want to leave a comment on the changed line. Okay, so it's the ID plus 3. All right, next merge request version, they changed 2 more lines. So the ID has gone back a little bit. We can still calculate the offset, right? Like the ID of the line coming back has changed, and the offset is going to be like +5 now because the comment has like moved down a little bit. There's more diff lines in there, but that's like, nothing is deterministic, I guess. Like everything has to be computed on the fly. Like what's the ID of this comment? Well, it's the new diff first line +5 because that was the old diff +3 or whatever. Mm-hmm. It would work, but I think IDing each line is it sets us up for more success in the future.
Yeah, and the less, the less the back end has to do any calculation, like, I mean, it makes my life easier, but I think it's also just simpler to treat the back end more like just the data store for the front end application, right? So we're not mixing across that boundary what we're calculating. Okay. I just want to make sure I understood why you needed it and like what its role was.
I think that's the only reason. I really want other people to check me on that, because IDing lines has been sort of, I mean, right now we really only go by like file IDs, and then we do line codes for like scrolling. I think the only reason we need ID lines is comments, but I could be wrong there. I could be missing stuff.
Well, the IDs are also they're calculable, right? Because they're consistent around like the old line, new line. Right. They're a constructed identifier.
Right.
So in theory, we could just send you the parts.
Yeah.
There's a couple more things that we use the line. So Stanislav identified, so anchor links, if you're linking to a line, of course, we need a way to identify those lines. And the other is code quality feedback. So you know how you have those little like stripes, the big gutter to the line numbers and stuff. So essentially, any declaration we want to do on a line, we would have to have identification for each of those lines some way or another. Yeah, that's
I was thinking about like all the different places where like just the whole concept of lines is just baked into everything, you know, on the back end. So it's like if you take that away, or if you significantly modify it, right? It's actually a huge conceptual change in the code. So it's just like, because we have that concept, we built all this stuff around it. So you take that away, like now we have to figure out how to unwind those assumptions. So for example, in the code, the code quality report annotations, if we didn't have that concept, or if we had it less strongly, how would we have solved the problem? Probably, you know, maybe we would end up at the same place. I don't know.
You mean if we didn't have the concept of the line codes, how would we have solved the code quality problem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we're I want to add one more thing to the mix. I feel like that's the moment to add it here. So one of the natures of the current implementation that ideally we could improve in the new implementation, or in a theoretically new implementation, is this. Currently, the blob hunks that were rendered on the UI are based on the lines that were changed by the MR, right? And then we request the comments on a separate request, and then we match them up. This makes it this nature makes it complicated for users that want to comment on an unchanged line outside of that scope. So they want to scroll to the top of the file for the definitions of constants or something. They want to leave a comment like, "Hey, add a constant here" or something like that. If they do that, I'm not even sure if it works at the moment, but if they do that, the UI won't reveal it, because the next time the MR loads, we'll get the blobs only with the context lines around the changes. And then the comments come along, and then we basically have a line hash that we don't have a line to attach it to. So this might mean that we might want to rethink even the way we're doing that as a whole, this dissonance between the notes and the diff lines, if we can improve that. I'll add another level of food for thought. Some competitors do allow commenting, not on the line level, but at the code level. And some allow you to go in like just a text select kind of thing. I want to select this part of a line. Others do it as a code object. So I'm commenting on an if clause, I'm commenting on a function, I'm commenting on a class. So that's going deeper than just the file line resolution. Since we're discussing these things, this might be a good opportunity to consider, are there ways that we can, while improving performance, introducing some new feature set as well, that could potentially raise the bar for the quality of our products when reviewing. Just wanted to share that.
A couple of times I've thought about how we could calculate highlights on the front end, and I think the only way is if we have like the full file, and then the diff says of this file it's these lines that are different, because then we could compute the syntax for the full file at the time. But I don't know that I can't think of a way to make that efficient, because like downloading an entire file for every diff would be, pardon my language, but that would be insane. I don't know how we could do that in our UI. With the one caveat that if we can figure out some way to do this more efficiently, we could cache full files, like you download it kind of on demand. The full file is cached, and then we just kind of parse out the diffs in the middle of it. But to your point about commenting on sublines, actually in that spike issue that we spun off last time, I linked out this document that I created a long time ago about why we need IDs. And just a brief overview. This is like the top bar is like how we are currently, where we're trying to ID files like after the front end gets them. And I am proposing that the back end here basically has the ID, so that once we get it off the API, everyone agrees on what the IDs are. And the reason for that is I was like, hey, at some point in the future, we would probably want to be like commenting on code hunks with an abstract syntax tree, or however we'd like to parse it. We can start commenting on subline chunks, and we're going to need a way to identify individual lines so that we can parse out hunks of code. But I just wanted to mention that because it's what you just said, Andre, about being able to do more nuanced stuff on diffs.
We already have a request for allowing users to comment on commit messages and maybe even file names. So in the current implementation, we don't have a way to do that. I feel like this opens another box, right? It's not just about delivering the align IDs. It's like, how do I identify the things that can be commented on and not? And equate all of the MR versions variations. One thing they do really nice, I just added to the note, but I didn't voice it. One thing they do really nice when they allow you to comment in the object of the code is that the line changes because you change something above it. Like the comment can persist across multiple MR versions because you comment on that class definition, which again, it's much deeper complexity, but will be a nifty thing. Does any of this sound achievable, or should we open an issue to, because tied to the next issue that Carrie, I don't know if you created that issue for the pre-calculating syntax highlighting on push. If you did, please add a link to the agenda, the one I'm selecting right now. So tied together with that, we could potentially have some smarter ways of annotating that, not just syntax highlighting, but we could have a couple of more smarter operations done to it to reveal identifiers. We can annotate it with, beyond the syntax highlighting, annotated with identifiers that would be used for everybody. And those identifiers could be smarter or dumber, depending on how much we want to go in terms of resolution of commenting. Any of these sounds achievable, or should we just cut scope or focus on the things that are trying to solve the performance on it?
I think that we should consider a future world where we have the ability to comment on class names or file names or whatever, and so we should build that into whatever we plan to do here. But I think we should keep the scope to how can we deliver syntax highlighted lines more efficiently or whatever, while keeping that in our minds. I don't know. since this spawned from how can we make diffs faster, I guess, since the microcode review, like proof of concept was the start of it. I guess it would be interesting to see someone else also create like a proof of concept of like commenting on commenting on the AST, I guess, for some code.
Commentable objects inside MRs.
Yeah.
If we abstracted enough, lines are just a commentable object in an MR. So are the commit messages, so are the file names. So if we abstract that to that point, then the line just become commentable objects. And I wonder what that opens for us. Like you said, we can prepare for now implementing the commenting on lines while already preparing for deeper resolution and other things we could comment on.
Yeah, I mean, on the back end, like we're already set up to things can be notable, right? So you can attach notes to whatever you want on our side. So I mean, we'd have to extend things a little tiny bit, right, to support E-type, but like at the end of the day, it's just another thing to associate. So if you want to comment on names, if you want to comment on people's avatar, or I don't know, whatever, their use of emojis, like, have at it. We'll set it
Look
up.
on their avatar and be like, this is not great.
Yeah, this is more of a user experience question.
This is outdated.
Terry,
I
you
have
should
a
get some
beard
fresh
now.
gifts. You've been a staff engineer for too long. New gifts, please.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Well, I was just going to kind of read or back up both of you that I think Andre, your note about, or your comment about generalizing discussions or generalizing whatever in MRs to be things that you can act on, whether you comment on them or not. I think that's a good maybe path forward of saying, let's stop treating lines as our foundational, like, special thing in MRs and just start treating them as one of a type of thing that you can interact with. Because at some point we could break that down and be, now it's not just lines, it's also small pieces of code. And like you said, it's commits, it's those kinds of commit messages, those kinds of things. So maybe a approach here is to start breaking down MRs into more generalized chunks of things that we can start attaching general behavior to.
Yeah, I mean, once you get rid of the line concept, if you're just dealing with diff blobs, right? Then if for example you encounter that situation, right, where like, oh, the lines disappeared, so now I don't know where to put the comment. It's like, I don't know, put it at the bottom of the file, or like you can kind of like, we kind of work around solving some of these problems once we remove that dependency in our thinking on, I have a line, I think in a line, and what do I do with it?
The more we're talking, the more it seems like we're not looking for necessarily a UUID in the format of what Thomas is describing. We're almost looking for like a URN or even like sort of a URL. And I'm thinking more like in the RDF space where we have vocabularies, defined concepts, and we could have like a vocabulary of things that can be commented. And then the identifier itself would be the locator. So we could then, the front end could then use that locator to know how to render them out. So in the locator, we could extract, is this a comment? Is this a file name? Is this a commit message / and then in front of it, we have the ID of that object, whatever that is. And that will be the format of the UUID probably, I guess, the Thomas has been talking about. But if we start with that baseline, we could then extend the number of object types that we could support in the future without restricting ourselves to lines. If we started with the lines, but then expand later. Since we're on the topic of IDs, this might make sense in trying out. Coming back to the top, it will be nifty to have a POC to have this particular problem solved. Have a string act as the glue between the two things, between the notes and the diff lines, if they come all at once. That's still a question to be answered. So that's what that spike is about, I guess. So all that's probably missing is scheduling that spike, I guess. Have a back end and front end assigned to it, or a full stack, maybe a principal engineer. I don't know. But yeah, I'll leave it open, but we'll definitely keep that issue in mind to try to schedule in upcoming milestones to see if we can get some answers in that sense. Is this feasible? Can we try this out? And whoever picks that up, I'll let it know as a homework to watch this recording. Have all this food for thought absorbed.
Very,
Right.
very optimistically or very, very naively, I think this is actually a pretty light lift for front end. I'm not 100% sure about that, but if the backend is delivering us fully baked diffs, and the idea here is maybe just swap out IDs or something. The front end just has to kind of make sure that we're computing, like matching up IDs and diffs properly if the IDs change. Otherwise, we just dump this fully baked diff into the DOM and attach discussions just like we do now. And I think this is going to be mostly back end like lifting here. I'm not sure. Obviously the front end, we run into issues all the time making the most minor changes. So there's going to be issues, but I think a lot of the work is going to be back end.
Yeah, we just need to figure out some translation thing. We'll figure it out.
Okay, so I think we've discussed that part enough for this call. We haven't gotten to the bottom of it, but we have a call next week, so and the week after that. So I'll move over the discussion to that pre-calculating the data we need to render the MR. So Carrie, is there an issue for it? And do we have any more thoughts on that particular topic since last time we discussed it?
No and no.
No and no. Okay, so that's fine. We'll need an issue. Need an issue. And the thoughts I've given it is, if I'm not mistaken, the system we have to do these sort of things is we would schedule a job to generate the files we need for each MR upon the push of a code change in whatever UI interface thing you can use. Command line, web ID, web UI, all that stuff. So if there's a code change, push into the repository, we should schedule a task to regenerate the files needed for that MR. If there's an MR open for that. What do we use to that? What can we use today to achieve that? Is that a Sidekiq job? Is that something else? Do we know?
Yeah, it would just be an asynchronous Sidekiq worker.
Okay. Well, the question becomes, in the meantime, the MR is outdated if accessed. But we can always generate on the fly if we need to, just be a slower experience if it's not ready yet. Correct. Sort of. Okay. I don't know how this Sidekiq.
Almost.
Pretty correct. There it is. What if the MR isn't ready yet? Page 1 fly.
So just
Okay,
so,
that's probably
just so
something
that
to take into account.
just so I know, the benefit here is basically for large MRs, the user doesn't have to wait a long time while an on-demand request parses the Git data and creates a diff for them to see. It just starts happening, and then when they visit, they get a cached response or they get a precompiled response. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah,
here?
the complaint that the problem that has been presented to me is that you generic you see that the slowness is from the highlighting that's happening on the first load. And so if we accept that at face value, it's like, okay, well, how do we get rid of that? Well, recalculate it, right? Just warm the cache. Because if 2+ loads are fine, then let's just move generation to the 0th load. Yeah, I mean, that was the whole.
It's paying, you will incur in paying the computation price before the MR is even requested. And that is something to be considered, because now if we have to run code, if we have to do a task for every code push, regardless of the MR is open, we might be doing work for nothing, right? Between 2 pushes, the MR might not be rendered at all. So the question here becomes, when does that become a positive payoff, right?
Right.
Where,
I mean, because it's not just that calculation, right? It's also the caching, because now we're caching
Storage.
everything all
right?
the time. Although, yeah. Because clearly, right, like not every MR is visited via the UI. So not every MR would benefit from doing this. So we'd be end up caching a whole bunch of stuff for no purpose.
Use
that's
machine
why I want-
learning to guess whether it's going to be rendered or not, whether it's going to be requested or not.
Yep, I guess we can go home. ChatGPT
Yeah,
solved it.
Solved it.
May I solve
Fixed
it? I was just going to say,
There
I
you
think
go.
probably the easiest way we could do that is if a human being went through our UI and created the MR that way, maybe they're more likely to visit that MR once code is pushed to it, versus if an API created the MR. But I don't
Then
know.
again, yeah,
I think that
Go ahead.
at the end of the day, though, we're fundamentally there's a difference between looking at this issue of like the pre-caching. I think it's committing to to what's happening now, right? It's committing to the standard code, the status quo of how we're generating and displaying and understanding and interacting with diffs. Whereas some of the stuff even that we talked about today, I'm like, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that anymore, right? Or that's not so much a problem. So like, yeah, if we just get rid of lines, if we're just dealing with the AST and diff blobs and things, like, great, we don't have to deal with highlighting anymore, fine. Or, it changes it significantly enough that like, would that even be the bottleneck for performance anymore?
yeah, that's interesting. Just the idea of having that data pre-calculated when we arrive at the MR is really enticing, but there's a lot of questions now. And again, which data are we talking about? Is it the specific response that this front end will get? In that case, we could even prepare this in a way where Rails is not even involved in requesting that data. Well, we have privacy concerns, we have access permissions kind of thing. We probably do need to go through Rails, but it will be just a read from a file and this is delivered to the front end. It should be much faster than creating databases and handling and all that stuff. So,
right. And like, I mean, like even as I'm just sitting here thinking about it, I'm like, okay, well, maybe the Rails isn't the right, because Rails gets the event when a code push happens, but like maybe that's not the right place to do it. Maybe it's Ghibli. Maybe Ghibli needs to respond back to let us know if there's another thing. And that's actually really kind of implies another service entirely of
right.
a service that just highlights and sits there spinning all day, happily highlighting things for us. But it's like we have a truck, right? We have this really awesome truck that we built up over the years, and it's super awesome, and it's great for crawling over boulders, but we're really worried about fuel economy. Well, you've just like suggested like a Formula 2 car now, in like other ideas. It's like, well, that's a whole different, we still worry about fuel economy. It's the same problem, but like, is it as much of a problem in that context? So I'm not that we have to commit to one or the other, not that they're exclusive, but I don't know. We have limited resources to kind of push towards solving any problem. So
for me, the thing that keeps bouncing around in the back of my head every time we have these discussions is that at least we on the front end, maybe, we have taken perhaps for granted that we need the back end to do highlighting. And to me, highlighting is a front end concern. That is a thing that like the back end should be delivering us the data, the diff files or the files and the diff information, that kind of stuff. And the front end should be highlighting it. And in a couple of places, we've experienced issues with a particular highlighting library kind of failing when we don't have the full context of diffs, because like it's in a weird scope of the file, and then so the highlighting breaks because it doesn't know it's in some structure. I think maybe we should think about a little bit more how it could be possible to just remove highlighting from the backend entirely. Because, for example, in the proof of concept at the top of this document, in the microcode, the review, the highlighting is happening on the fly as you scroll near a file, it gets highlighted instantly, and otherwise it's just blank text. So you can still do the Control F in the browser and find diff because it's there. It just hasn't been highlighted yet. And I'm not sure that we should continue doubling down on the back end being our highlighter, rather than solving the problem of why we can't highlight on the front end. Because I think that's really where we should be putting this.
You're gonna hate me, but I think exactly the opposite. So I remember reading a long time ago on a computer science book the history of thin clients and fat clients and moving processing from like the mainframe then to the clients and then go back to the cloud, and it's the everlasting yo-yo travel of the data computation where it should go, right? And when we're talking about the web and we're talking about a diff that could be like 2 lines that we need to show to the user, well, 2 plus context would be like 20 lines at something. You show 20 lines of a file that is like a 3 megabytes raw file to highlight. Potentially what I can think of, we could have the raw file highlighted still on the back end, but the front end can be smart and be the one requesting the intervals we need from that highlighted file. But such an intensive task where theoretically to highlight properly the diff chunks, we should highlight the whole file to have the context right, according to grammars and stuff. It's challenging for me to imagine. And again, by the way, I'm not thinking on a context of a UI based on VS Code on a tabbed interface. I'm thinking an interface like the one we have in diffs, which is a list of file changes, right? And we have many of them, and we need to make it performant, fast, and all the jazz that we have been trying to do in the past couple of years. To me, it strikes me as very challenging to be able to do this performantly on the front end, leaving that way from the back end, at least the initial pass. So that's where I'm standing. From all the things we've seen, for the blobs, we got away with that because we do have to request the blob anyway. So we have the blob entirely. So the highlighting is kind of like okay to do that.
Yeah.
We're still having struggles with performance on that side, by the way. That's another part. It's not relevant here. And then there's language support, which Highlight.js is not as good as Rouge at the moment. And that could be just a potentially time will give us better support on the front end for languages, but we're not there yet.
So just on this a bit, clients are getting faster, right? I mean, even there's more compute sort of at the client side than overall at the server side, right? In part. So I was wondering whether this comes in the realm of crazy ideas. Is what if we don't use Highlight.js, right? And instead we use some fast library in C++, something like that to do the highlighting, compile it to WASM and push the highlighting to the WASM piece, right? And that is one possibility.
We've discussed in the past the possibility of using WebAssembly for such a intensive task, that we could forward some libraries to the front end by using WebAssembly. We're open to that. The question for me always comes to the nature of the web, right? We want our users to be able to load the MR regardless of where they are, fast networks, slow networks. And the diffs sometimes do touch on very large files. And we have the example of our blog release blog post, that the files get so huge that the MRs have always been like breaking down performance-wise on that MR. So it used to be real large MRs. And we have customers, that's all they do. Like some of the customers are using MRs to revise all the code going into a release, for example. That's thousands of lines to be reviewed. So even if we can find a way to make that case for some MRs, we won't be able to get them for the largest percentile, for the largest MRs percentile. But the WebAssembly could be an option to kind of try to port some of the libraries we use or C to be able to run them on the browser, on the work, or somehow. I don't know. But to me, it's the bandwidth that we're going to have to travel, to bring the entire file, to highlight it, to then extract just a few lines, seems wasteful to me. That's my take.
So I didn't mention this.
Entertain that in a little while.
I think that is the absolute worst case for highlighting on the front end, like the absolute worst case, because these highlighters are pretty good. I mean, you see, I don't think you've seen it break down when you post MRs into the demo that I did. And that's just with nothing. It's just like highlighting this text. If we have a breakdown of like what it doesn't understand what scope it's in, so it's highlighting incorrectly, you don't need the full file. You just need enough to give it so it knows what scope it's in, right? If it doesn't know it's in a function, you just need to go back enough to tell it, oh, hey, here's the thing that you're inside of a function or a class or like whatever. You don't need a whole file. You just need like just enough to give it the right context. And that introduces a whole other level of like what is doing the parsing to know to give it the right amount of context, but needing the entire file, like a 3 megabyte file or whatever, theoretically is like the worst case scenario for highlighting. I don't think you would need that always.
But those are known situations, right? It's like we know ahead of time, like this file is so big, or it's a particular format or language or whatever. It's like, we'll just do that in the back end. We'll do that. We'll just do like, I don't know, certain kind of Go header file. We'll do that in the back end, right? I mean, like we just may not be able to come up with some magical solution that fits every single possible thing the users can ever possibly ever throw at us. Like I think Kai was just sharing today, the customer was like, oh yeah, we regularly have 9,000 line diffs, per commit. And that's getting real close to our limit. Like maybe we just need different tools or different processes for handling different kinds of files or different size MRs along the way.
Question that has been bugging me for a long time. We keep talking about how like Highlight.js, for example, which by the way, that's the one that I have used. I think the source code has used that one. Is that the right tool? I don't know. I mean, is that the right one? Anyway, we keep talking about how Highlight.js can break down sometimes. And I'm always wondering, how does Rouge do it? Because like, this is not a problem inherent in like highlighting. It's a problem inherent in like, we don't have enough of the diff to know the right context to do highlighting properly. So is Rouge loading the full, are we loading the full file and then highlighting the whole thing and then only returning the changed lines? Like, how is Rouge better at this than other highlighters?
It's just older software. I don't know. It has more support. It has been extended. It has been supported throughout the years. So of course, probably the support is better because of that. But I don't think it's necessarily a shortcoming of JavaScript. But this is probably a shortcoming of the tool we're using, Highlight.js. have better support.
It's so, I mean, that answer sounds right. It sounds fine. But it's so weird because that means that Rouge has some code in it somewhere that like just knows how to resolve these like, I don't know what scope I'm in bugs. That if that's true, then theoretically we could just port those over to Highlight.js and solve all problems.
Yeah, I mean, if highlighting's important to us, let's make it important, right? Let's show it's important and invest the time in doing that.
I think some of it is the library though, right? Like it is the age of the library. Rouge you continually see issues opened in Rouge for like add support for this language, add support for this language, and Highlight.js just doesn't have that yet. And it was the same issue we had in editor and all the Monaco based things. Like syntax highlighting in all of the Monaco stuff uses I want to say it uses like TextMate structure, which doesn't exist necessarily for every language either. And so like we have to either contribute it back into like Monaco, or you have to give it like different like paths of where it can go find like the syntax highlighting definitions. And so like I know the language gap between Rouge and Highlight.js is pretty significant, like in the order of several hundred languages different. So I mean, it is just time.
Right. Well, I guess the finding is like if whatever JS library is faster and better, and it fits with like this new paradigm we're building, like, and if it covers 80 or 85% of our users, then great, let's do that. Because the other 15%, they're not going to notice any improvement. They're not going to notice a decrease, right? If we continue to use Rouge on the back end to cover their weird, whatever little language they're using. It's very dismissive of me. Sorry, Ada. Sorry, Haskell. Sorry, whatever. But right, like,
do we have fallback data, Andre, like from Highlight.js on source code? Do you know how often it's falling back?
Yes, I think that has been added to telemetry. So I know that Jack and Person do have those numbers.
Yeah,
so we fetch that and get that in an issue to watch them.
Yeah, that'd give us a rough idea of how often we would fall back, and then sort of like what the impact would be of shifting things around, like how many people would potentially benefit.
I'll try to get that for next call, and I'll probably. So which issue should capture this discussion? Seems like it's a separate one, but highlight. Thomas, since you opened this option again, do you want to create an issue for us to capture this discussion in?
Yeah, I'll create an issue. I also want to, this is just to give Kai, I'll give you a heads up. I also want to dig into the supported languages and stuff, because the lists, the list of languages visually, I can't do a diff in my mind, but the list of languages supported in Highlight.js, for example, is similar, maybe not quite as large as the list of languages supported in Rouge. So I want to dig into that as well. So I'll open an issue to be like talking about, I guess, how our highlighter work. Is it just Highlight.js we want to kind of inspect more? See like why it breaks down sometimes, language support compared to Rouge. Do we want to roll performance into this? Be like, can we do some testing? What's sort of the all-encompassing issue here?
We're not married to Highlight.js. That's
Sure.
my answer.
Yeah.
I think we should do some benchmarking as well. I think benchmarking is an important part of this. So understanding different JavaScript libraries and what the benchmark is against, large or diffs rather. I mean, there are two aspects to this. One is benchmarking and second is accuracy, right? That's the two dimensions you want to kind of measure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'll open an issue just talking about how Highlight gets to the front end, and focusing specifically on maybe the tool that we want to use, whether it's Highlight or something else.
We'll move over to there. We're at time. One of the things I might want to throw in there is the crazy idea of using WebAssembly to run Ruby in the browser, then have Rouge run there by, installing it on the client side once and then running it for all pages. We have a service worker, so we could use that to negotiate the loading of that Rouge thing in the first load kind of thing. So you maybe want to throw that in there, Thomas, into the issue, so we don't forget about that possibility. But yeah. Great discussions, everybody. Anything before we go, or should we just call it? Push the button. All right. Thanks, everybody. Great chat. Have a great week.